Sport is a term that's thrown around a lot these days in the automotive world. For Land Rover, it would appear to define more aggressive styling and a slightly tighter setup without actually compromising on practicality. But up until now, there has only been one car with both the words Land Rover and Sport on it. But when they expanded on the Range Rover lineup by introducing the Evoque and Sport models, it seemed inevitable that there would eventually be another car with a Discovery badge on it. And so here we have it, the Discovery Sport. Admittedly, this car is probably going to be about as sporty as I am tall, but in comparison to its bigger brother, well, that's another story. But before we get on to the more interesting stuff, I need to talk about what's going on under the bonnet, because under there we have the brand new 2-litre Ingeniun engine, which is now going to be used across a whole host of Jaguar Land Rover products. It makes around 180 horsepower, which is all you really need, but it can feel a little bit underwhelming if you're used to that almost arrogant whoosh you got from the full fat Disco, which is a little bit irrelevant, but that's just the opinion of a particular presenter. In terms of noise and smoothness, it is a vast improvement over the old 2.2 Freelander engine, which it is of course replacing. It also has a 9-speed gearbox where first gear is sort of reserved for off-roady stuff, and then when you're driving around town it'll pull away in second, so there really isn't much engine noise and it's all rather good. But the one thing that is a little bit disappointing is the fuel consumption. With this new engine, Land Rover promised an average MPG of around 53, but in reality we've been getting around 38. Now, it's normal for car manufacturers to twist their numbers slightly, granted, but that is pushing it a little bit. Anyway, to go back to the sportiness for a minute, the suspension setup is a little stiffer than I was expecting, I must admit, but the advantage of that, of course, is that you can really throw it into the corners now. Now, moving on to the off-road ability of this thing. I'll admit that most of these are probably going to be spotted picking up the children from their Saturday morning rugby practice at the local private school, or maybe in the summer they'll make use of that fancy all-wheel drive system to tackle the grass car park on sports day. But in all seriousness, I don't for a second doubt the off-roading ability of this car. There will probably be areas where a full-size Range Rover or a good old analog Defender will have the upper hand, but Land Rover still seem to design these cars with the mindset that at some point in the owner's life they're going to have to climb Mount Everest or map a new part of the rainforest. And on that point, this car even has an SOS button in the roof console in case you get lost in a blizzard on the way home from Waitrose. Land Rovers tend to be cars that speak for themselves when it comes to off-roading ability. You always know that this is going to come out on top of an Audi Q5 or a Volvo XC60 in that respect. And on that note, again, this car has also achieved the highest safety rating in its class, even beating the Volvo. Anyway, we've still got all of the off-roading gadgets and gizmos that we know and love in here, including things like hill descent and all of the different driving modes. The one thing we don't have is the adjustable air suspension, which when I first found out, I thought it was really going to hinder this car's ability to go off-road, but we've thrown it at some pretty deep mud ruts and it's just gone through it all. Now, these cars get a lot of criticism these days for just being overpriced fashion accessories to park outside of the local supermarket. Now, while I admit that the people that drive these things may have changed slightly, and not all of them get that muddy, their ability to go through the rough stuff clearly hasn't changed whatsoever, because it's just taken on everything we've thrown at it, and then it just turns around and goes, yeah, and? Were we off-roading? And it's not fazed by any of it. And it'll look good doing it. Because if there's one thing I really like about this car, it's the way it looks. For me, it has those sort of elegant lines of the Evoque, but combined with that aggressiveness of the Range Rover Sport, and I think it adds up to make it one of the better looking cars in Land Rover's current lineup. And the interior is rather lovely too. Actually, the inside of this car really cements its position as the Freelander replacement, which was always the awkward stepchild of the family. Because in here you now have the same equipment and level of quality you'd expect from a modern Land Rover. It is much more conservative, however. There are far fewer buttons around the place. And the computer system has been updated, but not necessarily for the better, in my opinion. One thing that really annoys me about this whole change is the fact that although they've reduced the amount of buttons around the place, they really haven't reduced the complexity of performing certain tasks. For example, I now have to turn on my heated seats using the screen up here, but I still have to push the button on the console. So to turn on my heated seats, I now have to push as many buttons as you would to launch a nuclear missile, when there was absolutely nothing wrong with the way it used to work. In terms of aesthetic though, it's a lovely place to be, the rear seats especially, and I can tell you that there's enough legroom in there for a giraffe in Wellington boots. In fact, when the rear seats are as far back as they'll go, there is as much legroom in there as a full-sized Range Rover, and yet they still manage to fit 2 extra fold-away seats in the boot. Rather impressive. The other thing I absolutely love is this new panoramic roof, which is all kinds of cool, particularly at night when you have a starry sky. It's rather mesmerizing and fits rather well with the new mood lighting option. Altogether, for a reason I can't quite put my finger on, this car is quite a cozy place to be, and it is a bit of a TARDIS, because from the outside it's not a big car at all, but from the interior there is just so much room in here. I think it pretty quickly becomes clear that Land Rover designed this car with families in mind. I think they always needed a car in this range, but the Freelander never quite lived up to it. And now they have this, which is practical and yet maintains the upmarket feel of its doubly priced Range Rover badged siblings. And yet, this, for starting price, is £1,000 cheaper than a Volvo XC60 and £2,000 cheaper than an Audi Q5. And I think these are going to become increasingly popular as Land Rover expands their range to meet the needs of every man and his dog. I only hope that they don't get in over their heads on that path and continue to actually make cars that serve a purpose. I'm looking at you, Evoque convertible.